intended as another man struck it with a sledgehammer. Dangerous work in the candlelight. In fact, the whole process of extracting precious gold was very intricate. After the explosion, the miners trucked the stone out to the tunnel entrance, where it was put in a crushing plant. It was fed into a deep little vacuum box, where mega scalpers crushed the stone to a fine powder. Next, it was washed with a stream of water over a series of copper plates that were coated in mercury. As the gold flowed over these plates, it formed an amalgam, and once a week the machine would be stopped, the amalgam collected, then heated. The mercury then vaporized, leaving gold.
Walhalla Goldfields Mine was a significant gold mining operation located in Walhalla, Victoria, Australia. Active primarily during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it played a crucial role in the region's gold rush era. The mine produced substantial quantities of gold, contributing to the town's growth and prosperity. Today, the site is part of Walhalla's heritage, with remnants of the mining operations preserved as historical attractions, offering visitors insight into Australia's gold mining history. Join me as I take you on a tour inside the gold mine.
Well, they're just right in.
Level surface, we don't go up any levels or down any levels. There's a couple of areas in the mine that are a bit low. We're all going to have to duck our head to get through. It can also drip water on you in places, and the floor is going to be muddy and slippery as well. We ask that you don't touch the walls or the ceiling of the mine while we're in there, and that we all stay together too. Please don't wander off on me in there, don't lose anyone. Also, when we go in, if you're just walking between these tracks, it's just the safest place to walk so you don't trip over or hit your head. You're more than welcome to take videos and photos in the mine. It's also got electric lighting all the way through it too, so even if we do lose power out here, we've got backup lighting in the mine, and I'll always have a light with me as well. So if anyone was having second thoughts, that was your chance to take off. It does happen. I've done that plenty of times. All right, looks like I'm keeping everyone, that's good. All right, I'll give you a bit of history before we go in on Walhalla. Now, gold was discovered here in 1862. It was discovered by a man called Ned Stringer. He was a ticket of leave convict, he'd been free, and he comes here with three other prospectors. And we pretty much start where the Thompson River Bridge is, and he follows the creek into town. So pretty much the road that you drove in when you came into Walhalla, it follows the same course as that creek. Now, when they get into the very southern end of town, about where the cemetery is, they'll start to pan the creek there, and they're finding a very fine alluvial gold. So not the big nuggets and things you'll find like around Bendigo and Ballarat. It's a very fine gold, it's almost like a dust, and they have to pan for it. Now, once Ned realises he's got quite a bit in that creek, he knows he has to make a claim for that. So he takes off to a place called Bald Hills, it's now called Seaton, and he makes his claim over there. But for him to get from here, get over to Bald Hills and get back again, that takes him about 2 weeks. And in that time, there's plenty of men in the area who work out something's happening here. Even as he made his claim, there were 14 men that followed him back. Within about 3 months, they've got about 300 men in that creek, all looking for their piece of gold. And they pretty much cleaned the creek out in those couple of months. And they realised to have that gold in the creek in the first place, it needed to have come from somewhere. It had to have a source. So they went looking around town. It was up behind us here on the western ridge that they find a big outcrop of quartz. We've got a big piece of that outcrop over there in the garden, that big piece of white stone you can see. When you find that, the gold is visible in the stone, and there's a lot of soft puggy clay around the quartz as well. That would have had gold in it too, that was getting washed out in the rain. That's what they were finding in the creek. Now the quartz reef runs for about 5 kilometres through Walhalla, and it runs in a north-south direction. So when they dig this mine, they dig it east-west. They want to try and intersect the quartz reef and hit it head on. Now a lot of of the early mines in town, they started really low down on creek levels, and they were getting pretty good gold within about 2 years. Now here we're sort of halfway up the mountain. They weren't sure how they were going to go, because they knew the quality of the reef decreased in gold the higher up they went, and it improved in gold the lower they went. So halfway up the mountain, they're not sure. They still got shareholders together though. They raised about £14,400, and they start the Hercules United Gold Mining Company. And it was on this spot in 1865 they started to dig this mine. That's what I'm going to go into today. You ready to get in there? 16, 17, 18, 19. Alright, we're now roughly about 111 metres into the mine here. Now it's only taken us about 2 minutes to walk down to here, and it's taken the Hercules United Gold Mining Company 2 years to dig to this point. You can still see the gate, we haven't come in very far at all. And they're digging it all by hand, and they're using the hammer and tap method. So this is a hammer and our tap. Now the tap is just a piece of steel that's got a hardened end, and it's got 4 points on it. Now it would have been a two-man job, like you see in this photo up here. So one miner would be holding this up against the rock face, and the other miner comes in behind him with a sledgehammer. He's trying to hit that as hard as he can. Now every time he hits it, the man holding it has to turn it a quarter of a turn. So he'll take another swing, hit, he's turning it a quarter of a turn. So every time he turns it, those 4 points are just crushing a little bit more rock inside the hole, and they're going in a bit deeper. Now to create the mine, they're going to need 20 of those holes in a big arch shape. They'll have about 5 in the centre in a cross formation, and they go in about 2 to 3 foot with each hole. They'll be then filled with a black powder. They'll have a wadding and a fuse placed in there. They run the fuse out of the mine, then they blow that section out. And they have 2 young boys. They come in with little wooden wheelbarrows, and they'll be removing all of that rubble. Now finally they'll have a miner come in with one of these pickaxes, and he'd be cleaning up all the ragged edges that were left in the mine. That was taking them about a week to do all of that, and they're probably only getting into the mine about a metre each week. So you can see it's taking them a long time to get in here. Now they're not getting paid very well at the start either. They're only getting paid about 24 shillings for a foot of work. So in today's money it's about $7 a metre. So it's not a lot of money. And it wasn't paid to the men directly either. That would be paid to the mine manager, and he would disperse that amongst his workers. So if you got on really well with the mine manager and you did a good job that week, you might have got a bit extra in your paycheck. But if you've really disappointed him that week, you're probably going to get a bit less. So it's a really unfair way of being paid. It's also pretty dangerous sort of work. If you can imagine swinging this sledgehammer around for 8 hours a day, it's going to get pretty heavy, and you don't want to hit the man that you're working with. He's not going to appreciate that at all. And halfway through the shift too, they would swap positions, so he'd have a chance to hit you back as well. So you wouldn't want that to happen either. But if you did hit him, say you'd broken his arm or his hand, something like that, there was no such thing as workers' compensation back then, but the men would get together and they'd make sure he was looked after. And if you were the guy that broke his hand, they'd really make sure you felt an obligation to be putting some of your pay into keeping him going until he could get back here and earn money for himself again. So it was good the men looked after each other like that. Now they're also working in pretty dark conditions down here. This mine won't get electric lights in it until about 1903. So in the very beginning they're using candles made from tallow, made from an animal fat. So they don't let off very much light, and they've got a pretty foul smell about them as well. Now the men would be lucky to see each other's faces or even the areas they're actually working in. And we know that led to problems. There was a story of 2 men who were getting ready to blow out their section. They fill up all the holes with black powder and it was the end of their shift. So they go home, the 2 new men come in to take over. They think they're going to do hammer and tap work. They blow themselves up down here. So you get a lot of horrible sort of stories like that in these mines as well. Now also in this part of the mine, you'll notice we've got this little bit that runs off to the left over here. And you'll notice that part of the mine's a lot smaller than this main adit that we're in now here. Now that's the original size the mine would have been at the very start under Hercules. It would have been that size all the way to the very portal at the start of the mine. You can still see the original roof height that came out about here. Now all of this main adit got enlarged much later on in the mine's history when they had to get heavy equipment down to the very end of the mine. But at this point it would all be that size. It doesn't go straight ahead yet either under Hercules. It was all this size up to here, and this is all still rock face across this point. It just takes this weird little bend. And the reason it does that is because they get a new mine manager, and he's under a lot of pressure from the managers, directors of the company, people like that, asking what is going on down there. You've been underground for 2 years, you haven't found anything. So he tells them he'll be able to hit the quartz reef a lot quicker if he takes off in that direction, which is a bit of a story he sort of made up in his own mind, really, because the mines were designed from day one to hit that quartz reef head on. So he must be under a lot of pressure from these men. He makes up his story and he takes off in that direction. The sad thing about that is if you look up this part of the mine, you see where the tracks start to bend and the floor is just lit up a little bit. That's actually where the quartz reef is. So he got this close to it and he takes off in that direction. He has about another month onto his work doing that. Now we're going to go down the old part of the mine now. Unless anyone's got any questions for me before we move on. No? Easy. Right, if you want to follow me as we come down here, watch your head as we come into this part of the mine. There's some real low bits in here. And if you do lose your hard hat, make sure you put it on before you stand up too, because that's never pleasant. Now, it wasn't a very big mine for these guys. They didn't have a lot of money. The first thing they did was chase the reef off in that south direction. They get about 10 metres past that last light you can see, and they have to stop digging because they meet the end of their claim. They also meet a bunch of men from the Royal Mint claim who were chasing the reef from the other side. Now, when they buy the mine, they know the stone from here to the surface is pretty poor quality, so they're not interested in that. What they remember are all the early mines in town that started low down on creek level. They're getting good gold within a couple of years, so they want to be part of that. So what they want to do now is abandon all of these workings that were in here. They want to go back to that main adit that we were just in, and they want to continue that into the middle of the mountain until they're high above this quartz reef. And they're going to dig a shaft that goes down about 180 metres. They think if they can do that, they'll be able to intersect the reef at a much lower level where it should be full of gold, and it should start making them a lot of money. Now, has anyone got any questions while we're in here? All good. Keep moving. A bit, just so everyone can see into this corner here a bit. Alright, we're now roughly about 240 metres into the mine here. Now from that intersection we were just at, and to get down to here, it's taken them another 4 years of digging. Now most of that's still being done with the hammer and tap until around 1875 when this gets invented. That's the pneumatic rock drill, and that makes their life a lot easier. They can get through the mine in double time when they're using this. The problem is though, wherever they're using these drills in the mine fills up with dust. The men are breathing that in, it's settling on their lungs, and it's causing silicosis, or otherwise known as miner's complaint or black lung. So for about 15 years in these mines, they're a pretty lethal place to be working. You wouldn't want to be in here at all if you knew. Now the miners knew the dust was a bit of a problem. They didn't realise it was going to kill them eventually, of course. And if you see early photos of the early miners, they'll have big thick moustaches and big thick beards, and they're trying to filter out a lot of that dust. But it's just not working for them. So a miner that would start in this mine around the age of 18 is probably going to be dead by about the age of 28. He'd be really lucky to get into his 30s. That's why this ends up with the nickname the Widowmaker. Now things do eventually change for the miners, and it didn't change because someone's suddenly worried about the men's health and safety or anything like that. It changes because they're worried about these rock drills. Now they're overheating all the time, and they have to have downtime to let them cool down. So no mine manager likes coming to work, seeing all these men doing nothing. So something is eventually done about it, and it was this thing here. Now it's an American invention, and it was called the Colorado drill bit. Now it had a hole in the base and a hole in the tip, and they would have inserted water through that. So now wherever they're using these rock drills in the mine, that water keeps the drill a lot cooler. They can work them for a lot longer, but it's now also turning all that dust that they're breathing in into a fine mud, like a slurry. So it became so much more healthier for the men eventually, but as I said, out of no concern for them, they just got lucky on that one. Now, also in the miner's kit, he's going to need a couple of these little things. Now that's called a miner's spider. Now, he's going to need that wherever he's working in the mine, but he won't be supplied it by the company. He's going to have to make that himself or go and visit a blacksmith and get a couple of these made up. But wherever he's working in the mine, he'd find a crack in the rock and he would hammer that into it. He'd have his tallow candle that he'd place into the ring. Now, when he lights that candle, it's going to burn for about 8 hours. So he knows once it gets down to the very bottom here, it's nearly time to knock off. He can start to pack up his gear and get ready to get out of the mine. Because now that the Long Tunnel Extended Mining Company have the mine, they've got much bigger plans for it. They'll start to run the mine now 24 hours a day. So I've got a morning, afternoon and a night shift in here, and I'll end up with about 50 men on every shift. Now, in the peak of the mine, the company will have a staff of about 268 men working for it. Now, as we go through into the next part of the mine, I'll get you to have a look on the right-hand side where the first aid sign is, and you'll see some original graffiti that we've got in here. Now, it's the initials GEW and the year 1890. Now, we've still got some of the original paybooks for the mine in the museum, so we've been able to look through all the employees, and we found a man by the name of George Edward Whitlow. So we're pretty convinced that they're his initials on the wall. He worked here from about 1872 to 1878, so we're not sure of the year. We tried to research him, we couldn't find out much about him at all. So we're assuming he either came back and paid a visit, or more than likely he'd passed away and someone's done a little memorial to him on the wall. So have a look at that as we go through, unless anyone's got any questions for me before.
That's easier all the time about it.
That's good.
Right, this is our small machinery chamber. Now this was built to house a Cornish boiler. We've got a picture of the Cornish boiler up here on the wooden sets. That boiler was in here to create all the steam that they needed for all the rock drills, all the pumps, the winches too, they were steam driven as well. It originally sat here on these brick foundations that the sets are sitting on today. It was about 2 metres wide and about 6 metres long. And that one boiler would burn about 5 tonne of wood per day. Now eventually in this part of the mine they'll end up with 5 boilers down here, so they're burning about 25 to 30 tonne of wood per day. So it gets pretty warm in this part of the mine. It gets up to about 40 degrees. And they needed a way to keep the mine cool, that's why we've got the ventilation shaft over here. Now that just runs around the corner, goes flat for about 5 metres, and then it rises up to the very top of the mountain on about a 35 degree angle. There's a little gate at the top and you can just pop out up there. So once that's put in, it creates that nice airflow that we get through the mine. You can sometimes feel a bit of a breeze on your face when we're in that main adit. So it's keeping the temperatures down now in this area, and it's keeping dust down in this part of the mine as well. And if something was to ever happen at the very entrance to the mine and we couldn't get out down there, then we can always use that as an emergency exit to get out of here as well. Now during mining, that was keeping fresh air down to about 9 levels underneath us, just with the natural circulation coming through. Now to have the boilers inside the mine, it's a pretty unique feature of this gold mine. If you've ever been to other mines, you certainly won't see the boilers inside them. Even places like Sovereign Hill, they have a big shed at the very entrance to the mine and the boilers are kept out there. They'll pump everything they need into the mine that way. Now in this mine, they were losing too much pressure trying to pump down to the multiple lower levels underneath us that they had to bring these boilers in here. And that's the reason the main adit had been enlarged so much too. It was so they could get these boilers in here. Is they brought them in sections and they assembled them in these chambers. So pretty big job actually getting them into the mine. Now also in this part of the mine you'll notice we've got these big wooden sets in here. Now they're not actually holding anything up, they're totally precautionary measures just to have it safe as a tourist mine. But they're called pigsties. And the reason for that is if the mine ever did move and put pressure on that wood from above, the wood's supposed to let out a noise like a pig squealing. So you know if you come to the mine, you hear a wild pig in here, you want to get out pretty quickly because the roof's about to come down. But this part of the mine is very safe. WorkSafe love this place, they come and visit us quite regularly. They've done a laser scanning in here now and they can tell if any part of the mine moves by up to a millimetre. This area we're in just doesn't move, so we're very safe down here. Now also up on the roof you can notice the rock bolts and the geomesh. Now they're not an original feature of the mine, they get put in about 1982. It's when a company called Walhalla Resource Limited came into town and they took a lease out on a lot of these old mines to do some exploratory mining. So they put the rock bolts in, they go about 2 metres into the rock and they're there to hold the whole roof together as one big piece. And the geomesh, that was just to collect any stone that might fall while the men were working in here. But you can see just above us here, there's only a very small handful of stone that has come loose since 1982. It's a very safe part of the mine. But this company came in to take core samples. You can see one of their original drill bits there, that rusty bit of pipe. And they were taking their core samples from this part of the mine over here. You'll see all these holes that go in on all sorts of different angles. And they all go into the stone about 200 metres.
Wow.
Now, we're not really sure what they were hoping to find here, because we already knew that the stone on this level of the mine was pretty poor quality. We know they didn't find anything worthwhile, because if they did, there'd be a really big hole in that part of the mine where they went to get something out. But they were only in Walhalla for about 7 years, and they only had about $5 million to spend. So it's not a lot of money in mining. They can go through that very, very quickly. Now, for the other two companies to get to this part of the mine now, it's taken them 14 years to dig down to here. And still no one's made any money out of this mine yet. They're still just throwing cash in, keeping their fingers crossed. Now, the Long Tunnel Extended Mining Company, they've got a lot more money to play with. They'll end up with about £58,000 of shareholders' cash. So in today's money, you're looking at about $50 million there. So you can tell as we get down here, they've got much bigger plans for this mine compared to Hercules out the front. And with this sort of money too, they can afford to dig for a lot longer as well. Now, has anyone got any questions while we're in here?
Got it for your life.
Oh, look at this. It's funny. Oh, wow.
Right, this is our large machinery chamber. Now, when this was originally built, this was over 42 metres long. This was enormous, this chamber. We're left in less than a quarter of what was here. Now, unfortunately, behind me in 1986, they had a collapse in the mine. We can't get into that area anymore. Unfortunately, too, the main shaft was involved in that collapse, so we can't see that either. But this chamber was built to house all their machinery. There would have been another big boiler in behind the brickwork here, and another big boiler in front of it. And there was two more upright boilers over at this corner here. And as I mentioned with the boilers, they're burning a lot of wood, about 30 tonne a day. So they've got a lot of smoke they need to get rid of. So another area where it is for these boilers couldn't be off by a couple of centimetres, it had to be precise. So they have to start digging here, they've got to chip that rock above their head, then they come back later and they're bricking up the chimney around themselves. Now we're only 150 metres under the ground here, and it takes them 3 years to dig that chimney. So it's either it goes just above the roof of the mine, and it rises to the left for about 15 metres, and then it goes to the surface from there. And it's got that chimney brick lined all the way to the surface too, because they couldn't afford it to collapse in on itself while they had it in use. So they needed that to be unlocked at all times. Now, once they get the chamber set up to all their machinery, that's when they want to dig their shaft to go down. Now, they start that in about June of 1881, and it doesn't take them long now. They've got explosives, they're being in. So from 1881 to 1886, the company had a really big turnaround. They took out about 40,000 ounces of gold just in those couple of years. So the company's finally starting to have some success. Now, up here on this map, I can show you some of the mines that we've got in Walhalla. So at the very southern end here, that's where you would have driven into town. And the northern end, that's up where all the campgrounds are. Now, this is us, just about in the middle, Long Tunnel Extended Mine. So we've all just walked along this part here, and we're standing right about here. Now, the shaft I talked about behind me involved in the collapse, that was it. It went down 937 metres under the ground. Now, when they got down to this level, they lose track of the quartz reef. They had to send out more drives to try and relocate it, and their last little effort would have been 2 hours until they actually came and got you out. So it's not ideal. Now, things will change though in 1901 when the Long Tunnel Company digs the Incline Shaft. And when they dig that, they dig it through a couple of different claims. So one of them being this mine. So they can end up trading off with things like firewood that was really valuable in the day, and they'll allow them to use the incline shaft to get the staff in and out. So once they use that, they can get 14 men in and out at a time now. They get into a little wooden trolley, they're sort of sitting beside each other and they're almost leaning back on the man behind them. Now the trolley they're in will be attached to a winch, but they pretty much just get gravity dropped down this shaft. And we know there's a winch man at the top, and he hears a series of bells. He would know what level to slowly pull them up at. But we know this would have been a pretty terrifying ride, this one. Because the incline shaft was 4,000 feet from the top to the bottom, and they could do that in 4 minutes. So that meant they were coming down that shaft at about 50 kilometres an hour. We thought that can't be right, that sounds dangerous. So we've looked into it and that's exactly what they were doing. So it would have been a pretty terrifying ride, especially this part where you came off an incline and then it drops into the vertical shaft. So you're nearly being tossed out of that cart as it comes around that bend. And as far as we know, they never had an accident on the incline shaft while it was in use, which was pretty amazing in itself, really. Once they use that for the men, they can begin to use the main shaft here to bring all the ore carts out. They would have been lined up along these rails that you see over here. Now, conditions on the bottom of the mine too are pretty horrible. They're having a lot of trouble with water in these mines. The men down the bottom here, they could be working in knee-deep or waist-deep water. Even areas halfway up the mine, men are working in ankle-deep water. Now, they're trying to pump it out, but the engineering involved in that just means the water gets heavier and heavier the higher up they're trying to pump it out. So they're trying to pump it out in stages, but that just wasn't working. The men that spent too long in that cold, muddy water too, they would get what they called miner's foot. So a bit like trench foot that men got in the army. They would lose feeling in their feet. That would lead to things like gangrene. Worst case scenario, they're getting their feet amputated. So yeah, pretty horrible conditions on the bottom. Another problem they're having now is gold. You can see the reef has become pretty limited and they're not getting a lot of gold returned back either. Now, the costs of running the mine are being outweighed by what they're actually getting back in gold. Another problem was firewood. And if you've ever seen photographs of Walhalla in the old mining days, there is not a usable tree around for about 8 kilometres in every direction. Every tree was being cut down and used in these mines. This mine even had a lease out to the north up to 20 kilometres. They were using a steam train to bring their wood back into town that way. So with all these factors starting to build up, they knew they had to close the mine, and that ended up happening in 1911. Now, when they did finally shut the mine down, they ended up taking out 312 ounces of gold. So about 13.7 tonnes of gold they took out in the end. So not bad. In today's money, you're looking at about $1.5 to $2 billion worth of gold there. So they did pretty good eventually. Not as good as the neighbours though, the Long Tunnel Company. They were in town the longest. So they ended up taking out 24.5 tonne of gold out of their mine. The Emperor Shaft at the southern end, and they only had a very limited part of the reef to play with down there. They still take out 4.4 tonne of gold. And you come back up to the northern end, you see the Console Shaft. Now these guys dig for 26 years. Let's see what they found. Absolutely nothing. They poured money into that company for 26 years and they didn't make a cent out of it. And you can see how unlucky they were too, because the angle of that reef was on an angle that was supposed to be coming straight to them. They even spent time looking for it. They thought it's got to be here somewhere. Now, unfortunately for those guys, the reef had a twist in it. And it twisted under this claim and it dropped straight down. So it benefited this company really well, but not so much for the poor Consols guys next door. A lot of bells. So every time it stopped and every time it started, you're hearing these bells in the mine. Now they had bells in here literally for everything, from winding, pumping, winching. There were bells going off all the time. We know if you heard 10 bells in a row, that was an accident in the mine. And if you heard 15 bells, that was a serious accident. They wanted you to leave the mine. So you'd always be listening out for these bells, trying to count them up in your head every time you heard them. Now, as for deaths in the mine, they really only have a record of about 50 men dying down here. And we've always thought that's pretty generous, really, considering the conditions they worked in. When we looked into it, yeah, and they weren't getting enough heat out of it, apparently. They just keep the boilers hot enough, so they had to resort back to wood. I think black coal probably would have worked, but yeah, the brown coal, I don't think they were getting the heat out of it. Is that anyone else? Oh, keep moving. All right, I'm going to follow you around with that, I guess. Now this is where they came when they had a little bit of a break. Now originally in this mine, if you came into work for an 8-hour day, that's exactly what they expect from you. They're not keen on giving you a break.
But I think the other little one was getting cold. Being cold doesn't appreciate being cold.
So this would be where they had their meals. Where's that tin? There's a bucket in there somewhere. Thank you so much for the tour.
That's all right, no worries.